Assassin's Creed has always relied on its protagonists to give each historical period a sense of direction. No matter how impressive the cities are, how detailed the lore becomes, or how many secret societies are pulling strings in the background, the story only truly finds its shape through the person you're controlling. It's funny how in the other major pillar of Ubisoft, Far Cry, the exact opposite is true, where the actual villains are more important to the story and are the characters we actually end up remembering. Well, in Assassin's Creed, I can't name a single villain from the top of my head. Something Borgia, maybe? But when it comes to the protagonists, well, that's a whole different story. Altair, Ezio, Edward Kenway, Bayek, Eivor are the kinds of characters you latch onto almost instantly because their stories and personalities give you something real to hold on to. But they can't all be great, can they? Well, no, because Alexios is and he's the reason we all gathered here. Jokes aside, when your connection to the driving force of the game weakens, the experience starts to drift in a way that's difficult to ignore. Fortunately for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the game in which Alexios blesses us with his presence, you can and should pick Cassandra for your playthrough. But why does Alexios come so short in terms of, well, not being dull? On paper, he has all the makings of a compelling character, a childhood marked by tragedy, a life built around wandering ancient Greece as a mercenary, and a personal story that ties into the game's biggest mythological and political threads. Yet, the longer you spend with him, the more inclined you are to turn on a podcast instead of hearing the game's dialogue. Scenes that should resonate feel strangely flat, and the emotional weight that usually defines Assassin's Creed protagonists never quite materializes. So, in this video, I want to take a closer look at what makes an Assassin's Creed protagonist work, but more importantly, why Alexios ends up falling short in ways that reveal some deeper issues with Odyssey's approach to storytelling. And yes, I do believe he's the worst protagonist in the franchise's history. I know some people might put Jacob Frye on this pedestal, but I honestly quite liked him. And Syndicate is one of my favorite games from the franchise, so leave my boy Jacob alone, will you? One of the reasons Assassin's Creed grew into such a long-lasting series is that its strongest protagonists don't simply exist inside their historical periods. Whenever you step into the shoes of someone like Ezio, Bayek, or Edward Kenway, there is an immediate sense that their personal conflicts belong to the world around them, and that the events unfolding throughout the game are somehow shaped by their personality, rather than just the plot beats written around them. Even the smaller conversations or the quieter exploration moments feel richer because you understand who they are and what they're carrying with them. Ezio's story, for instance, works because you feel that growth every time he speaks or reacts to the people around him. There's an ease to his presence that lets the narrative shift in dramatic ways without losing cohesion, because he remains the emotional anchor regardless of how chaotic things become. Bayek, on the other hand, brings a completely different tone. He approaches the world with a seriousness grounded in loss, a sense of duty, and the instinctive empathy of a man who understands what it means to suffer and lose everything. That personal foundation gives Assassin's Creed Origins a weight it wouldn't have had otherwise, because so much of the story revolves around the moral questions Bayek carries with him. And Abubakar Salim's performance of this character is nothing short of perfection. Even Edward Kenway, who begins as a reckless opportunist, gives Black Flag its identity through his transformation. The game's themes of ambition, freedom, and consequence all develop naturally through his arc. You don't need a story to constantly remind you of what he's going through, because his voice, his choices, and his gradual shift in values make it clear on their own. And because pirates are cool. When Assassin's Creed gets its protagonist right, the whole narrative lifts with them. Dialogues feel sharper, set pieces become more memorable, and the emotional through line becomes easier to follow because the character you're controlling has enough depth to tie everything together. That consistency is vital, and it's something the series has relied on for years. And that's why Alexios feels like such an outlier. The precedent had been set, and Odyssey had every opportunity to continue it. When you first look at Alexios on paper, it's easy to imagine how he could have evolved into a compelling protagonist. Odyssey places him in a Greece overflowing with conflict, culture, philosophy, myth, and political tension. His personal backstory is filled with the kind of dramatic material that should naturally guide a strong character arc. A childhood shaped by tragedy, a family torn apart, a destiny wrapped in prophecy. These are the ingredients of a story that could have been deeply emotional and thematically rich. More so, Odyssey's world itself is vibrant and full of personality, and the scale of the game suggests a journey that should feel sweeping and epic. The idea of a wandering mercenary navigating rival cities, ancient conspiracies, and legendary creatures has all the makings of a character who could stand alongside some of the best leads in the series. And in the early hours of the game, you can kinda sense the intention. But one of the clearest issues with Alexios is the way his performance sits at an awkward angle to the tone of the narrative. While the story reaches for emotional depth and dramatic weight, the way Alexios delivers many of his lines often feels exaggerated, almost theatrical in a way that doesn't match the atmosphere of the game's most important scenes. Instead of adding some intensity, the delivery tends to pull you out of the moment, leaving you aware of the squeaky performance. When other characters speak softly or earnestly, Alexios' tone sometimes feels too bold or too casual. When the scene calls for vulnerability, he maintains a kind of confident detachment. Even in moments that should be filled with grief or reflection, there is a strange absence of emotional shift in his voice. And listen, Assassin's Creed protagonists don't need to be understood to be effective, but they do need to sound like they are reacting to the world in a way that fits the stakes of their situation. With Alexios, the performance seems misaligned with the weight of the narrative, and it creates a distance between the player and the story that becomes more noticeable over time. And while we're talking about why Alexios struggles as a protagonist, it also helps to look at the other side of Odyssey's dual lead system, because Cassandra highlights everything the game was actually aiming for. Her performance has a balance of confidence, warmth, and sharpness that fits naturally in the world Ubisoft built. When she speaks, her tone matches the weight of the moment, and you can feel her shifting between humor, frustration, grief, and determination in a way that gives Odyssey's bigger scenes the emotional textures they need. What really sets her apart is how comfortably she sits inside the script. The dialogue feels like it was shaped around her attitude and rhythm, which makes the story flow the way it's supposed to. Conversations that feel awkward or strangely hollow with Alexios suddenly make sense when delivered by her, because she carries the emotional nuance required to make those interactions feel believable. Even when the writing stretches into mythological territory or leans heavily on the game's RPG elements, Cassandra maintains a sense of identity that anchors the chaos around her. And quite frankly, the most telling is how often the community points to Cassandra as the canon choice, even though Odyssey technically gives players two options. That consensus didn't come from marketing or lore debates. It came from the simple fact that she feels like the character the story was actually written for. Her presence, delivery, and emotional range align with the narrative in a way that makes the entire game feel more cohesive. As you progress through Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it becomes increasingly clear that the narrative was built around Cassandra as the intended lead. When Alexios steps into that same script, the lines simply don't resonate the same way. Simply put, Alexios often comes across like a participant in the story rather than its emotional center he's supposed to be. That alone would be a challenge for any protagonist, but Odyssey's grand structure amplifies the problem even further. By now, Assassin's Creed had been shifting toward a full RPG model, and Ubisoft created a system where the player can shape the character's personality through choices. In theory, this should allow Alexios to feel more dynamic and flexible, but the lack of a strong underlying identity means those choices never cohere into a meaningful arc. He becomes a character defined entirely by moment-to-moment decisions rather than someone with a recognizable internal compass guiding those decisions. Unlike characters in other RPGs who maintain a clear sense of self regardless of player choices, Alexios changes so dramatically depending on dialogue options that it becomes difficult to understand who he is supposed to be at his core. One of the most important themes in Odyssey is the fractured relationship between Alexios and his family, a narrative thread that should form the emotional heart of the game. But the way Alexios responds to these moments rarely feels rooted in personal history or genuine emotional conflict. Instead, the scenes come across as scripted events that the character simply observes. The confrontations that should feel raw, the reunions that should be bittersweet, the revelations that should redefine his identity, all of it passes without leaving a strong impression of how Alexios is actually processing these moments. In a game that relies heavily on personal stakes, this lack of resonance becomes a major weakness in Alexios. The tragedy of his childhood could have shaped him into someone hardened yet introspective. His travels across Greece could have built a sense of curiosity and growth. His encounters with legends and philosophical thinkers could have influenced his worldview in meaningful ways. And his connection to his sibling could have created a complex emotional arc filled with guilt, hope, anger, and reconciliation. But alas, Alexios ultimately stands as the weakest protagonist in Assassin's Creed because he embodies the exact moment when the series' commitment to strong character writing began to slip under the weight of expanding RPG systems and oversized design ambitions. His performance often clashes with the tone of the story, the script never really seems fully aligned with his personality, and the lack of a defined core identity makes it difficult for the player to form a meaningful connection with him. And that's a shame, because Odyssey, in my opinion, is a better game on paper than Origins. But Bayek is such a strong protagonist that for me, it's not even close. Origins is a far superior experience than Odyssey, and by no means Odyssey is a bad game. In fact, the game's strengths highlights the weakness of Alexios even more. He's the worst because Assassin's Creed is built on the idea that its heroes give history a human center, and Alexios struggles to do that in almost every way that matters. Assassin's Creed has shown time and time again that the strengths of its protagonists can define the emotional impact of an entire game. When the character at the center has clarity, depth, and a voice that matches the world around them, the story comes together in a way that feels memorable and personal. Odyssey had the potential to continue that legacy, but Alexios stands as an example of how easily that connection can fall apart when performance, writing, and game design move in different directions. And that's why he stands as the weakest lead in the series. In theory, if you choose to play Odyssey with Cassandra or Alexios, that should turn out to be the same experience, but it sure as hell doesn't. And on that note, I rest my case as to why Alexios kinda sucks. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on that next one.